Hello and welcome to part 2 of me talking about all the books I've read so far this year, many of which you may have seen on the video I did on Glass Bookshop. And speaking of Jason, the first book I'm going to be talking about is one of his faves, and that is Chorus of Mushrooms by Hiromi Goto. This book focuses on a family that has moved from Japan to rural Alberta, where they run a mushroom farm. In particular, we have the narration of the grandmother, or Oba-chan, who's the one who came over with her daughter Kiko, as well as the narration of her granddaughter Murasaki. The narrative structure of the book is largely a conversation between Murasaki and her grandmother, and there's just like a little touch of magical realism as well as a lot of Japanese folktales. The truly magical part about this book, I think, is the grandmother as the narrator in particular. I have not read a book that has such an incredible narrator who is like an older person, like a grandmother. The grandmother in this book is literally legendary. Okay, she's incredible. Goto's writing is, in a literary way, like kind of delicious. I don't really know how else to describe it, even though that's kind of gross. I haven't really admired somebody's like crafting of language so well since I read like War and Peace. The only other thing I can really say is that if you are somebody who's interested in reading Canadian literature, or you're invested in the canon in any way, this absolutely needs to be a part of your reading. And then I read Shut Up Your Pretty Stories by Teo Mutanji. This book, very rightly so, has been nominated and won a bunch of prizes recently, the most recent one being the Trillium Book Award, so you know, congrats. So it is categorized and marketed as a short story collection. I will say though, I don't think it's a spoiler, but even though this book is told in these kind of bite-sized chunks, it is about the same person. I saw in an interview that Taya said she chose to write the story that way because she wanted to show one woman experiencing other women and those kinds of relationships in different ways. So I think that's a really interesting way of writing it and kind of existing in the space between like a novella and a short story. The stories center around our narrator, whose family has just moved from the Congo to Scarborough, Ontario. The most impressive thing about her writing, I think, is this is a very like slim little book, and again, it's told in these bite-sized pieces, but it is so punchy. I don't know how else to say it. Like, it's really powerful. Her writing packs a hell of a punch in such a short amount of like space and pages, which I think is like a true marker of a really talented writer. The only downside of this book that also relates to the like stories being about the same person again is there is a lot of content warnings for such slender a novel, including sexual assault, abusive relationship stuff, suicide, addiction, substance use. Queer character though. So the only disadvantage with that is, unlike Sour Grapes by Jenny Zhang, where I could skip some of the chapters, you can't really do that in this book. But I've also seen that Taya has noted that this book is a lot more somber than a lot of her other writing, and she also has a lot of really great essays and articles that have been published that I really recommend you checking out. So I'm really excited for whatever she writes next. Then I read The Crying Book by Heather Crissell, which I was very intrigued by, not only because of this cover, hi hello, but also because it seemed like every single person was ordering this from Glass Bookshop, and I just want to be a part of the club. It is a poetic rumination, if you will, on crying, and it draws from science, history, art, literature, as well as the author's own experience with mental illness and depression to talk about the issue of crying, and also specifically paying attention to like motherhood and her becoming a mother, as well as the death of her friend who was a fellow poet who died by suicide. So this book is written in either kind of one-off observations or discussions, or larger threads that are frequently kind of returned to and woven together throughout the narrative. In terms of how the book is kind of marketed and advertised, all of the things that are listed from the online listing all ended up being the things that were more one-off observations and not like integral threads in the story. The only reason that was a problem for me is because I had an issue of reader expectations not being met, which is that one of the things that is used to kind of pique the interest of the reader, there is a discussion of how white women's tears are used to be complicit with white supremacy. I was all over this. I was very, very interested and was convinced to buy it literally just because of that alone. There's one kind of chunk where she very succinctly discusses the way in which white women's tears have been used to galvanize violence against people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous people. And she does it so well and wraps it up so tightly that it does not become an integral thread in the story. And I feel like there was so much missed opportunity there, because although she does note when she's talking about these more scientific studies about crying that there was a lot of biological racism and either just like not including people of color, but also like reaching out to Black community leaders to ask like, do Black people cry? I feel like race was talked about in the absolute bare minimum that it could have been talked about, and so I just found that kind of disappointing. I just felt like there was so much more like opportunity and space to really dig into the idea of how white women use and weaponize their tears. Then we have The Blue Clerk by Dionne Brand, and I've said it before, I'll say it again, Dionne Brand is perfection and we love her here. In particular, I think that Dionne Brand is one of the most incredible writers I've ever had the pleasure of reading, particularly when she is able to integrate both talking about like memoir with kind of sociology, political science, Black studies critique. This book was a little bit different from that. It is the most literary, conceptual book I've ever read. It is very much about writing about being a writer. I've never had to do so much research before I even started a book to know what was happening in the book. Something happened at about 60% of the way through this book where it just switched, and I just found it so endearing, and I just have had like a lot of feels about it. And I think part of the reason why was in some ways it becomes a little bit more personal. Also because I just read it during the day. And something I've really been, figuring out is that I really just need to read books that require more brain power during the day and not like right before bed, you know what I'm saying? So I feel like if I were to like reread this during the day at the beach one day, that would be it. Last thing I need to say, as a physical book, greatest reading experience I've ever had. Okay, it is a hardback with no spine. Hi, hello. Why are all books not this? It is so much easier to read. Do you see this? My God. Next we have Avoid Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, which I'm sure you've heard of before, but it is about the person that becomes Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre. We're following the story of Antoinette Causeway from her childhood to her marriage to Rochester. I really liked the first part, which follows Antoinette's kind of childhood and youth. And then in the second part, it's mostly from Rochester's point of view. It says in the introduction pretty explicitly that Jean Rhys felt the need to include the Rochester perspective because otherwise it would just be like some women's nonsense basically. So fully understand and appreciate that. I do feel vindicated because I've always hated Rochester since I read Jane Eyre when I was 14. Okay, talked about it before. The audacity of this British man to leave his dreary life in England to come to the Caribbean and then complain about how everything is too like vivid and bright and the food has too much flavor. Oh my God. What I appreciate about this book is that I learned more about the racial hierarchies and racial categories that existed under British imperialism, because I didn't actually really know what a white Creole was, who were the ones living in the colonies. In this case, they are the slave and plantation owners. Although the British imperial structure absolutely relied on their labor, they still aren't treated as being fully and correctly white. I'm still really glad though that this exists as an intervention into the literary canon, and I really wish there were more stories like this or more promotions of classics written by Black authors and other authors of color. Although if you're looking for some, I do recommend Seiji from the Artisan Geeks channel. She's done a lot of really great videos on that recently. So this was the point when I decided to read Percy Jackson, because all of the books I had read recently were just very intellectual and literary, and I was just a little bit over it. I just needed something with heart, do you know what I'm saying? After I finished the series, I just felt very lost. So much so that I decided to read Heidi. Heidi is not a story that I have any real association with as a child, okay? I was very into The Sound of Music, and I think at one point my grandma showed me one of the like movie adaptations that had been done, because I was very much in a moment of like, take me to the mountains so I can thrive. Again, you probably know. It is about this young child, Heidi, who is sent to live with her reclusive grandfather who has retreated to be a little mountain man, just living with his goats, doing his thing, okay, turned his back on the world because the world turned his back on him. I was expecting more of a Anne and Matthew moment, and that does happen, right? Obviously we see her improve the life of her grandfather and he cares about her, and it's like this very sweet thing. The first part of the book is Heidi chilling with her little goat herd friend Peter amongst the goats, living her life. And at first I was like, if anything happens to these goats, I swear to God, okay, I am not in the mood for this, Johanna. I'm gonna lose it. And then it turned into another 100 pages of a German family just mistreating this little Swiss girl. The book is very religiously conservative. Peter is the absolute worst. However, for some reason, I found this book to still be very sweet and endearing, and it weirdly kind of stuck with me. Then I read Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, which is the first book in his African trilogy. The story focuses mainly on Okonkwo, who is a strong man of an Igbo village, and he's like very revered for his wrestling and what he's been able to do for himself. I particularly enjoyed more towards the second half of the story, where we see a little bit more about the other people in his village, including his wives, his children. It's set just before colonization in Nigeria and includes the beginning of it with the arrival of the missionaries and then the other colonizers. The book also integrates a lot of folklore, which I really enjoyed, and there's a lot of discussion about different characters' relationships to their traditions, which I thought was really interesting. At the same time, I was also reading Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities by Rebecca Solnit. So this book discusses the ways in which hope is integral to resistance movements and social change, and not in a like toxic positivity, like denying the state of things way. As she says, hope gets you there, work gets you through. So really it's about how hope needs to be present in order to spark you into action. I really enjoyed that her examples and discussion for this were really like wide-reaching. She talks a lot about resistance through Black thinkers, as well as focusing a lot on South America, Indigenous people in South America, the Zapatista movement, as well as Indigenous people in North America, because she did a lot of work in terms of the anti-nuclear and environmental movements. She also talks a lot about despair and how, as she says, it's often premature and it's a form of impatience as well as certainty and also resignation. In particular, she talks about the way that the left uses despair as a way to resign themselves into inaction. She also talks about the way that leftist movements have a tendency to become puritanical, and that unless it's perfection, it's trash. It's the kind of leftism that I kind of came into cultural consciousness with when I was in my undergrad, so this was kind of a good reminder, and it also helped really ground me. Although this is not like a blueprint necessarily for like specific social movements, there's a lot of information both theoretically and experientially that are like really, really pertinent. The last book I have to talk about is Half-Blood Blues by Essie Adujan. Wow. Okay, I just finished this book recently, so I don't have a lot of like fully formed thoughts on it, but I think an indicator of how good it is that I finished this book days ago, and I'm in such a book hangover that I like can't really read other books right now. This book begins, okay, it's not a spoiler, it's like literally in the description, with Hirio, who is a jazz musician during World War II. He's a German citizen. He's also Black and is eventually arrested by Nazis in Paris and taken to a concentration camp and then never heard from again. In order to unravel how we got to this point, we hear their story told from this group of jazz musicians that was playing with Hirio from the perspective of Sidney Griffiths, who's originally from Baltimore and moved to Germany in the Weimar period with his best childhood friend Chip. As is probably obvious, this book deals a lot with the racial politics, racial categories, the way that white supremacy functioned, during World War II and beyond, specifically dealing with like white passing, being light-skinned, as well as Hirio. He would have fallen under the legal and derogatory terminology that was used under the Nazi regime, which was Mischlingkinder, which basically means like my children, where his father was one of the African soldiers that was taken from Germany's colonies at the time in order to occupy the Rhineland, and his mother was a white German lady. The way that she writes about jazz is really incredible. The voice of Cindy Griffiths is also really incredible. It's just such an immersive, incredible story. Like, I don't really have the words at this point, other than I highly, highly, highly recommend it. That is it for our kind of mid-year check-in on the reading. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you soon. Bye!